So our next speaker is Julia Baker, who is Head of Nature Services at Mott MacDonald. Julia has a wealth of experience in the environmental sector and expertise in biodiversity net gain, ecosystem services, and ecological mitigation. You probably already know her very well from her work on leading biodiversity net gain projects. She's the author of the UK's Good Practice Principles for Biodiversity Net Gain and runs a load of training with the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. And today, Julia is going to be talking about integrating climate resilience with biodiversity net gain. Julia.
Thank you very much, Dan. So, 12th of February, the UK government announced the world's first, and it was a world's first. This was the first government to introduce a mandatory requirement for most development seeking planning permission to achieve 10% biodiversity net gain. What's really interesting is from a climate resilience point of view, is the fact that biodiversity net gain habitats must be legally secured for at least 30 years, all off-site gains and what's called on-site significant enhancements. So inherently, what that means is climate resilience for our BNG habitats is essential. It's not a nice to have. And just because we're quite young, I guess, in terms of the way that we think about climate resilience for our ecology industry, doesn't mean that it's not important. For biodiversity net gain habitats to survive and thrive over that 30 years, climate resilience is simply essential. And Jim, fascinating talk, and thank you so much. And it was really interesting to hear certainly the work that you're doing. And I'll touch on the way that this is really emerging in climate resilience outside of BNG and how we can really tap into that. So I've been very fortunate within Mott. We've got a climate resilience team that I constantly knock on the door of and chat with them. And what struck me really when I started to enter this world of resilience was the definition. So there's a lot of things about climate adaptation, resilience, but a core part of that definition in terms of resilience is the ability to bounce back from climate change hazards. And if you think about our job, whether designing, assessing, or if you like, building biodiversity net gain habitats, a huge part of that is to buffer the severity of climate change so our BNG habitats can thrive. You know, it's not about deciding the fate of our native species, and I'll come to, there is a place of thinking about species selections, but it's about understanding the climate risks, and our resilience approach is to buffer the severity of those extreme weathers. So we've developed an approach here at MacDonald, which I'd like to share with you today. And this can apply to all manner of projects. And I really encourage you, no matter how small the development or how small your BNG, this approach can apply. And there's very pragmatic ways to build in resilience. And there's very, if you like, at the end of the scale, more detailed assessments depending on your size of scale. But I think at the assessment and design stage, if we don't factor that in, particularly when it comes to 30-year management plans, we're not doing our jobs because we're not handing over the tools that the maintenance contractors or the maintenance offset providers really need for the BNG habitats to thrive. So we start with data. And I was really fascinated actually to enter this world. Now that we've got to obtain climate data. Now, if you have a very small project, there's a range of different, if you like, quick and quite good climate projection data that you can tap into. So one is the generic climate projection headlines for England, but I encourage you to find sites such as this and the links on the slide. I think someone will post it in the chat. So and it's brilliant, there's a Met Office climate service for local planning authorities, and it's completely free. And it comes, there's a variety of different information there that you can dive into. Now, if you come to it and you click on the explore the climate in your local planning authority, so that's the one you need to click on, it pops up with this dashboard. Now, at the top right, or right on my screen, says select a local authority. I've just selected Kent, that's where I live, to give you an example. So you select that and it pops up with the map on the left. And along the bottom, it has climate data for the region, and I've selected summer precipitation rate so you can see the changes there. And it's about, when you get the data, you can see it's not just heat waves, or it's not just flooding. Our B&G habitats go from one extreme, one climate event to another. It's like the pin in the pinball machine. They're bombarded. And that's why our job is to buffer the severity of all climate risks throughout the year. And I really encourage you, if you've got a small project or you're just doing a very quick assessment, this is pretty good. There's other free resources out there, but this one is quite good. If you're a more detailed assessment or a larger scale project, or even if you're working on an EIA or a nationally significant infrastructure project, you might already have a team looking at climate resilience, or you can look at this yourself. The Met Office produced some of the best climate projection data in the world, and it's freely available. I put the link in the chat there, and it's the UKC summaries. Now you'll get a range of different scenarios under climate change to have a look at the projection of the future climate. I go worst case. So I go worst case. It's called RCP 8.5, which is the worst case emissions, the worst case climate change. And I do that because if I'm assessing the risks to B&G habitats based on the worst case, then hopefully I'm building a resilience that's going to be as bulletproof as possible. The level of data is extraordinary. You can get 12 kilometre, 25 kilometre grid square, and you get a choice of what climate data variables you want to have a look at. The go-to, if you like, are the rainfalls, the temperatures. They can have growing seasons, particularly useful in winter, so you can just see the continued growth of vegetation. Wind isn't the best in terms of projection, but it's certainly there. So if you are working on a large project, or EIA, or going through DCO consent, ask if there is a climate resilience team, and if there is, get to know them and talk about the climate data. And to give you an example of, our team have this kind of clever Python coding thing to extract the data. Now here we've got mean, maximum, minimum air temperature, and just amount of precipitation. What's interesting is that the baseline is an average of climate to compare the change against, right? So there's not a B&G baseline, it's the average of a climate to compare the change against. And I can see on this site, for this particular site, and this was a 12 kilometre grid square, this site, the B&G habitats will have 19% less rainfall in the summer. Then they'll go into winter and they will have 12% more rainfall in the winter. And it's with the data. With the data, it opens up your eyes to just see that our B&G habitats are just hit constantly. It's not just heat waves, it's that constant extreme of weather that we need to buffer the severity against. So you get your data and then you understand all of the climate risks. And then it is about thinking about assessing the climate risks to your B&G habitats. Now to give you some examples, and again, this is the important point, because then you can see in the round just what those climate risks are. For example, hotter, drier summers, that's going to be heat stress, dried soils, loss or damage from wildfires, increased pests and diseases. You might look at, there's going to be more frequent and extreme drought. So that exacerbates all the climate risks from heat stress, from dry soils. That could be a loss of hydrological connections. So if you're relying on ponds that have hydrological connections, that could be at risk. Wetter winters, there could be loss or damage from flooding, soil erosion, landslides, and increased pests and diseases, and extreme rainfall events, so the flash flooding and the landslips and the soil erosion. What's interesting actually, so one of the patterns is the summers get really dry and hot, and there's lots of drought, but the extreme downpours in the summer get worse. So you've got dry soils, a lot of drought, and then suddenly you get this extreme downpour. And it's the combination. It's not just heat waves, it's that combination that we need to buffer our B&G habitats against. So what does that look like? What does that look like? And I think I think our starting point has really been this concept of how can we protect and how can we do what we can to buffer the severity. And I encourage you to think about the toolkit, if you like, of resilient measures. Now, it starts off on something that we should be doing anyway, because diversity is when our habitats have a chance. We should be thinking about mosaic habitats, ecotones, those graded edges. Please, it's like avoiding the death by polygon. If those of you in the B&G community know, those kind of like the polygon UK have, think, no, just really design for diversity. Mosaic habitats, ecotone, even if you have double hetero, that's going to be far more stable against the incoming. And use natural shelters. So can you locate habitats where they're not going to be exposed? And this thinking has to come in early. And we all know, of course, there's going to be site constraints. And Julia, that's your corner for B&G. Believe you me, I've had that conversation. But it's really about understanding, well, how can we make our habitats bulletproof themselves? Water is essential. Now, I'm certainly not a water expert by any means, but I know I need measures that are going to retain water during the summer. Keep soils damp is essential, but I need to then enable the flow of water during the winter and even slow down the rate of flooding. And we incredibly lucky when you work on a big project, your neighbour can reach out to the team who look after the water designing aspects. But even if you're working on a small project, there are measures that you can do to keep the soils down. Think about the ponds and the scrape to retain waters, and then slow down the rate of water flow. There's the sub-manual about natural flood management, some fantastic advice in there. Drought response management plans, and prepare and respond to flooding events. The thing is, and I'll come to this, our job is to put those response plans in the HMMP, so when it goes to contractors or offset providers, they can price for that and they can be prepared. If they just get an HMMP that's saying, okay, you've got to cut the grass, and there's nothing about climate resilience, they can't fundamentally price for it and they can't be prepared to take it on. It depends where you are, but certainly in the southeast and kind of southern corners of England, a wildfire management plan is going to be essential. But also, interestingly, take care. I've seen some lovely B&G designs, but it was these large areas of grasslands. If there's a fire, that would just burn. So really think about looking about your climate risks. You can go back and see the media, where there are wildfires in this particular area, and just think carefully about your design. And the big one as well is going to be controlling INS, pests and diseases. So again, it really comes into making sure you've got a bulletproof control plan, and building in a few words saying use the latest monitoring and control techniques, because they will get better over time, especially over the 30 years of B&G. Don't lock your contractors into using something from 2024. Enable that. And just to highlight, there's so much that you can put in your habitat management and monitoring plan. I mean, firstly, just adaptive management, but you can have ready stock text. You can just have ready text put in here about a process to prepare for and respond to extreme weather events. So again, it's in your management plan. The contractors can price for it. A wildfire management plan, just in case they need it. A drought response plan is especially essential to make sure that if you're planting the trees in and out of the wet winters, and then it goes into drought in the summers, you've got that response plan to enable contractors to respond. And the really big one is pests and diseases, particularly in the larger growing seasons during the warmer winters, and into control. But again, as I pointed out, making sure that you put in phrases such as using the latest technology, using the latest control measures. So over the 30 years, as that technology improves and increases, and we get better at those responses, you've built that future proofing into your management plan. There's so many tools and resources out there, and it's brilliant to see so many people on the call. I mean, I think that there's such a need and an interest in this space. So there's a lot of tools and resources, but I do want to highlight this point about what do we do with our species selection? And there's some really interesting research coming out there, and this is just one example. For the moment, certainly in the management plans, that when I'm working on a large scale project, I put in the management plan to consider seeds sourced so local native species, but sourced in climates that are better suited for future climate. But it's if our original species really fail, so it's not swapping to that straight away, because this is about buffering the severity of climate change on our native species, not deciding their fate straight away, enabling them to see if they thrive. But year 10, year 15, year 20, if they really are failing, then you can build in that management plan, again, with safeguards in place that this has to be from, credible sources and with that integrity. But this research, which is really interesting and just emerging, will mature and get better and better over the 30 years of B&G. So I'm hesitant about swapping to that straight away, but it's something you can build in your management plan while this research and while this knowledge increases, but also you might need it down the line. There's one thing that our climate resilience team rightly remind me about: the people. So you can build in all these things for climate resilience for B&G habitats, but there will be people looking after them. Now, you might not be able to think about everything. What you could do is just say, okay, for contractors, they should undertake a climate resilience risk assessment. And that could be yearly, that could be 6 monthly. Chances are they're going to change their working shift pattern. If it's too hot during the day, they're going to work first thing in the morning and then last thing at night. And that's a cultural shift. We need to make sure their PPE or their maintenance is suitable for the weather. So you might have a few things, but at least you can put that in there, that there should be a climate resilience risk assessment undertaking for at least every 6 months or every year as well. And everyone, I think the big discussion is, what you put in your B&G metric. In 30 years, let's pop to site, have you seen that exact 2 hectares of woodland in that moderate condition in 30 years, given the uncertainties of climate change? Now there's a couple of things here. We do have freely available climate projection data. It is projection, so obviously there's an element of predictiveness around it, but it's not an excuse. It's freely available. So it's a way of making sure that our responsibility as B&G assessors or designers or even building Biodiversity Net Gain, we have looked at the data and used it to the best of our knowledge and really thought carefully about, what, this is an area that just it's flooding now a little bit. I'm looking at the data and it will be completely flooded. So that is our design responsibility. And I don't think we can leave it, climate change happened. That's why B&G failure. If we didn't have the climate projection data, but we do, so that's no longer an excuse. But we also need to be realistic. And again, it completely depends on your project and completely depends on your biodiversity net gain. But one thing to consider is think about design for 12, 15% B&G, but the consent should be for 10%. Now, this is a really important discussion. I'm not saying this is given, and I'm not saying everyone should do this, but I'm just saying that simple business risk contingency, designed to be ambitious, absolutely. Design for 12, 15%, but that gives you a bit of contingency. But especially for the large projects, we do have to recognise this is for 30 years, and I would get consent for 10%. But it's an early discussion that I wanted to bring to this forum here, because I think it's really key when thinking about climate resilience. And just to finish off, there's a lovely, lovely part to this, that if we get really, really clever with our design, there's a lovely way that our B&G habitats, when they're resilient, can help us to be resilient. And my last final point is I'm working on a biodiversity net gain lead for a new railway improvement scheme. And we are looking at biodiversity net gain, within the railway as much as possible, but it's very likely that we will need some part of our biodiversity net gain to be offset. Within the locality, this is an area that suffers really badly from floods, and the human cost of flooding is just significant. It's devastating. I know, and I've spoken to our executive board about this, that I think we can play a part with this, because I think when we look at our offsite provision with care, with good design, and there's a lot of thinking behind this, but if we're really careful, we can design our B&G offsite to deliver our biodiversity net gain ambitions in ways that help, in ways that provide natural flood management. And that's certainly where we should be going with this. Thank you very much.